And Dylan Penningroth, for example, uncovered the legacy of slaves who owned property, even while they themselves were defined as property. And they were able to do this because they received compensation for their property in military courts at the end of the Civil War, in part because the claims they made had long been affirmed in public community rituals and with the help of their kinfolks. And so we should learn from them in having the audacity to define our own legacies, especially when others tell us that those legacies are somehow off limits.
So it takes a boldness on our part to assert and affirm the legacy that we can put forward, right?
Yes.
Good, good. Second topic, aspirations. Whether it is building assets, whether it's wealth creation, which one could argue may be different than just building assets, or generally stronger economics. What do we think the possible futures are for us in that space? And how do you think about wealth creation, building assets, economics? Fred, you can start.
So one of the things we have to keep in mind when building assets is that they look different for our community, in part because we have a positive effect from our social networks in building assets because people help us out. So sometimes we get that white glove treatment by virtue of folks who can tell us how to most effectively take advantage of an opportunity when it arises. At the same time, we have to be realistic, and this is something that Brickson brought up earlier, that our social networks also can deplete some of those traditional forms of asset building. And so by this, I mean that one of the things that we've seen, and we've actually put numbers on it, numbers that I can't remember, is that when we are providing financial assistance to our kinfolk, when you compare us to our white counterparts who don't have the same kinds of requests coming in, at the same level of occupation, at the same level of academic achievement, we just have less available for traditional asset building. And so that just means that we end up needing to do more with less, and we do.
And to insert myself, I'm not supposed to as moderator. One of the challenges that the few Black people who quote unquote have some money has is we also have sisters and brothers and cousins and high school classmates and all sorts of not-for-profit organizations and nieces and nephews that are all pulling as well. And our white colleagues don't have that necessarily. So our philanthropy and our giving can actually stay within our circle, and that can deplete us completely. So that is an issue for us as well. But Brickson, your view on aspirations and wealth creation, et cetera.
So I think about it in around three levers, and that's freedom, power, and love, right? I want the freedom to really live up to my most vivid potential. And so that may be a pair of shoes or it may be a career choice, right? And I think that is the piece around wealth that I most value is the ability to have choices. And I think in this moment, I am grateful to be an entrepreneur because I get to sort of beat up my clients as opposed to be beat up by them, my employer, which we know that's happened before. And then that also lies into power, right? The power that I have and the power that a dollar bill takes for me in rooms because, we are a capitalist society. And so that power, and not just power for its own sake, but for its impact, right? And for what I can do for my brother and my sister and my non-binary identifying compatriot. And then it's love, right? The ability to love myself and to be in loving relationships with people who are capable of loving me. And so for me, those are the aspirations that I center my life around, and that resources that are not just money, but treasure is one, but talent and time that I'm giving and receiving are critically important in the communities that I'm able to exist in.
So if you're offering specific advice to someone who's listening now, and you can pick the demographic that you want, the type of person, a family member, a friend, a professional, or whatever. Let's be specific, both on this notion of wealth creation and how they should think about it, and legacy and how they should build it and deploy it. What are your views? What would your advice, your very strong, clear, tangible, pragmatic advice be? Brickson, you want to start?
Yeah, I think it is save your coins, right? I spent 11 years.
Be more specific, because people talk about save 20% of you make, save 50% of what you make. I mean, how do you, because, you know, some of us think if we have $100 in the bank, we save something. So
Right.
how
No.
do you really define savings?
I'm going to go beyond savings, right? I mean, you know, some of the practical things are max out your retirement contributions, right? To make sure you're investing those assets, to make sure your asset allocation is correct. And I think that, you know, so it's max out your savings in your IRA, your 401k, particularly if you have a matching situation. That's it. That's a key, because that's free money. Number two is to save really, you know, 20% of your income to the degree you can. And you know, I think for this group, that's probably even not enough aspiration. It's about the way you allocate your disposable income, right? And so I think that is about choices. And about both my biggest advice to folks when they asked me what I was doing in wealth management was you need to make more and spend less, right? And so what I'm going to land on here, Reggie, is the making more part, right? I think the savings piece is interesting, but critical is the making more and the leveraging your talent and putting it in the marketplace so that you are optimizing your income and your wealth creation. I think so too often we find ourselves as Black people and as Black gay men in particular being undervalued in the marketplace. And so if you're young and brilliant, they'll pay you less because you have time, right? That's time to get out and sell what you've got going so that you can capitalize and move up on the income stream. So I think, you know, I think the great advice about savings that you can read anywhere, but the thing I would say is you got to make more money and you got to figure out ways in which you can do that, whether that be a side hustle, angel investing, right, any way that you can to leverage your talents beyond a W-2 situation.
Right. Now, I'm glad you touched upon that, because there are those clearly that would say nobody gets rich just on a job, that right, you have to do some level of investment, whether it's entrepreneurial in the stock market or startups or something like that. And I know, Brickson, you've come from that investment space before, and I want to hear from Fred as well on this. But for a person who really wants to create wealth, as opposed to just save money from a salary or a job, without being specific, you know, how do you think about that? How do you step out on that?
Keep good company, right? So, you know, you want to be able to figure out how do you get into those deals that are, you know, exclusive domain of the white rich boy, right? So I think about what I'm doing right now is I'm making some venture capital investments. So there's a university sort of wide multi-university set of funds that invest alongside the investment committee members of the Ivy League universities, right? So I'm going to be able to put a part of my portfolio alongside what Brown, as my university, is investing in, that's delivering our outsized returns over the long term. It's a 10-year lockup, but because of my access on the Brown board and in this instrument, I'm able to get right at the deals that they're in. Because I tell you, when I'm spending summers with my fellow board members in the Hamptons, their kids are talking about deals they're doing, right? Our kids are not exposed to deal talk at the neighbor's really scrawny rib dinner. And that's what I'm trying to get myself in the way of. Mm-hmm. I think getting yourself in the way of those deals and those opportunities and those networks are the real secret sauce.
Right. So some of it is just a mindset of wealth creation versus having a job. And then getting in that network and building that network of people who talk like that, and you listen and build upon that in some meaningful way.
And act like that, right? Talk is cheap. You got people who are doing things. And, you know, we talk about Carla Harris, our dear friend, talks about mentorship, but sponsorship is critical, right? Somebody who's going to bring you into the deal and tell you do this and don't do that. Having those
Good. So Fred, your views on pragmatic solutions that can drive some of the things we're talking about here would be very helpful.
Yeah, so I tell my students, particularly as they're leaving college, 3 things. One is that for those who have student loans, often we will sort of choose the lower sort of monthly payment on those loans. It takes us longer to pay it back. And we pay a lot more back, and student loans are actually one of the things that are contributing to the wealth gap, holding other things constant. The second thing I tell them is that while we lift as we climb, there are a number of ways to lift. And so sometimes when someone's asking for assistance, there are ways to sort of point them in the direction of places that can help them build longer term resilience. And so long as they're not having one of those things where they're about to be put out of the house, try to make sure that you are linked up with other types of resources so that when relatives come, you're able to say, here's
it's 8 o'clock
that will be helpful for you.
Good.
So those are the things that I typically tell them. And then the final thing I tell them is that innovation is something that they should not be afraid of. And so innovation simply means that you're putting together two patterns that other people find jarring or unnatural. But then once the patterns come together, people say, oh, that's really innovative. The difficulty is that a lot of us are, I think we're conditioned to sort of think that we have to go down a particular pathway, and we're afraid to sort of step out of the norm. I think that's less so for gay Black men, because our lives are such that that has not been an option for us in the past. But it's something that I tell them to keep in mind.
So let me get real, if not provocative, for a minute. And there are some of us in our community who would say, I'm not sure how long I'm going to be here. The world is against me to begin with. I want to have fun now. I want to maximize my fun right now. I hear you saying save money. I hear you saying create wealth for some future thing that I'm telling you I'm not sure if I'll even get to. So how do you argue with that sort of perspective? It is a real perspective, and it is not invalid in all cases, but it is something that is not helpful in us as a community creating wealth or even creating legacy. What's your argument against that? Fred, do you want to start?
I typically try to find examples of people who are both saving and investing, but they're also living. And so if we sort of give them an image of something that puts them in a straitjacket and makes them feel as if they're simply living to work, then that's not going to really help. And so part of what I do is I try to find what is an early win that they can get to. And can we sort of tolerate having them be sort of not quite saving and investing as much as they should until they get comfortable enough to sort of up the ante. And so I think part of it is sort of introducing them to other networks of folks who are saving but still enjoying their lives. And so I think that makes a difference to have that close at hand.
Yeah, I'll jump in, Reggie. You know, one of my favorite, I have lots of favorite quotes about money. You know, one is I keep my money where I can see it, in my closet. But I think that's a hard thing to rely on when you are not healthy, right? And so health is wealth, and in the absence of health, you're gonna need some money. And so to Fred's point, I think it is about setting a floor, right? And so if you have that floor in place, and that is going to take care of you and provide the means for you to live above subsistence when the W-2 goes away, I really do feel like, you know, do you. I'm not going to shake my finger at somebody who has lived a life that may have been surrounded in scarcity, that wants to enjoy abundance, as long as they have a floor for the abundance to keep them at a base level.
Good. And I'm seeing a couple of questions from the chat. I would encourage people to do that as well. One is, if I can find it again.
I have one, Reggie, that I saw from Nate.
I see this one. Can you speak to the difficulty of home ownership for entrepreneurs who don't have a W-2? Ways to ensure success in the mortgage application process.
That was the one I was going to skip.
Yeah. That's why I wanted to ask it.
It's an asset question, right? I think that it's challenging in that regard. I think there are, and you know, mortgage standards tighten and loosen over time, right? And so that, you know, the state of the economy is going to have a real driver around how loose or tight those standards are. And where my mind goes to, you know, it's best to buy a house when you have a job, right? And so the degree to which you can either get one for long enough that you can make that transition while managing your own business is the easiest path, I think. But beyond that, it's just having the assets and a relationship with the financial provider. If you look at who got the PPP loans, they were the best customers of these large banks. or the best customers of the community banks, the small banks. So the strategy of going to a community bank or credit union that has the capacity to support the level of mortgage that you want to pursue, and putting all your accounts there, all your business accounts, and making sure they have a long track record of what your hopefully sole proprietorship, or you have all interests live, they will have a better sense of your risk profile and be able to take that journey with you.
Fred, did you have anything on that point? Or should I go to the next question?
I'll let us go to the next question. Yeah.
Okay. For people who have started late with investing, what is a good jumping in level?
It depends on what late means, right? If late means you are 60, there's not I want to be careful of your risk profile, right? So traditional asset allocation models, you say that when do you need this money, right? If you need that money tomorrow, you should put it in cash and put it as close to under your pillow as you can, because you need to see where it is and be able to get it. If late means you have 20 more years of career, realistically, you may be able to take some more risk. I want to say this. I have been stunned after spending 15 years in the traditional asset management business, stocks and bonds, in a mutual fund space, to see the outsized returns of private equity and venture capital. It is bananas. It is where wealth is created. 10-year lockups are the norm. There are a lot of losses, but there are some huge wins. And so I think making available to oneself, if you have the 10 years and the money to lose, again, I talked about having that floor, but if you're trying to figure out how to make these step function leaps, I think that those alternative investments, again, venture is most accessible to folks like us, unless you have much more sophisticated investment criteria, and that usually requires a minimum accredited investors $1 million in assets or $250,000 in income for the last 2 years. So I think those are spaces where you can make big money. And the last one is international markets, right? If you can go in and figure out a way to get into Africa, into a country where there's stability and structured systems.
Now, some people would say that's a misnomer, both in Africa and in countries that are stable with structured systems. So that's a challenge.
Relative, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some where you can see it ain't gonna work, right? But there's some places where you can take some risks, and I think keeping a company is again that secret sauce.
And
Fred, anything on that point?
Oh, I was just going to add that if you're sort of the median consumer, then some of what you do when you start late is see to the extent to which your employer has wealth advising or retirement advising as part of one of the benefit offerings that a lot of people actually don't take up. And so I know this personally because in higher education and also for public school educators, et cetera, a lot of us start late because getting a PhD takes too much time. And so you end up starting to do your accumulation in your 30s. And so trying to figure out from them, what kind of reasonable advice can you give me? And what I can also tell you is that when you're getting that advice, I've noticed that by virtue of what institution I'm in and what other types of things I've achieved, people get really nice about what you don't know.
Right.
And so one of the difficulties I think for some people is there's the sense that they're going to go in and be embarrassed, or they're going to go in and be exposed for not knowing things that they're supposed to know because they didn't grow up in the Hamptons having people just sort of talking casually about investments. I think if you can sort of go in and decide that what you don't know has nothing to do with you, and get some good advice and take it. So I think that's really important for folks.
Good. There are two really good questions here. One I'll hold to second, and it's following on my crowded at the bottom comment. Tell us what was critical to you rising to the top. Additionally, tell us about how did you feel always being the only one in the room, and how did you get greater representation? I want to hold that for a minute. And one that I think we also want to hear it, and Fred, you can start, is given the current state of race relations and reform happening on every level from police departments to media conglomerates, what are your thoughts on reparations? So I'd love to hear from you on that, Fred. And you, Brickson, next, and then we can go to the crowded on the bottom question.
Oh, reparations. So I think two things have to happen with reparations. I think on the one hand, there has to be some kind of public accounting for sort of the various ways that wealth has been stripped. So it's not just about, although it starts with the story of slavery, but there are other ways in which property has been sort of taken away from people who have had that property in their families for many generations. So I think part of what we have to do is have a balanced discussion, both of sort of the legacies of slavery, but also not letting that stop us in terms of our timeline, and being able to say, actually, wealth is still being stripped. And we also know that even in communities where people own homes, there's a recent Brookings report that the appraisers typically will value those homes at a lower lower value than homes that are equivalent to that home with the same number of amenities. And so what they've actually done is let's go count the amenities, and let's do basic counts, and let's look at the appraisal values. And so I think there has to be a real discussion about value, how it gets stripped and how it gets appraised, as a way of having a more comprehensive discussion about how do you repair.
Brickson?
Yeah, I'm gonna still that answer going forward, so be ready, Fred. But for now, I think it is an incredible opening negotiation point, right? I think that it needs to be paired with the conversation about reconciliation as well, and I think it's the harder of those two. And so I look at things like defund the police, which I think gives us a fundamental shift in the conversation, right? Those people, we have this continuum against which you ride, right? And so defund the police moves that conversation closer to justice. I think reparations serves a similar function. I don't know that if I'm scoring it from a negotiations model, that it is 100% probability it's gonna work, but I think it gives you certainly more than a 0% probability it's gonna work by starting there.
And it's interesting because historically, I've not been a supporter of the whole reparations thing. I thought it was a wasted conversation and that sort of stuff. But I've evolved over time and have been brought data that says, if you look at the number of people that have been oppressed by this country and got reparations, whether it was the American Indians or the Japanese after World War II, or many European countries after World War II, this country has done a job at creating some sense of reparations for other communities, but not ours. And so it's kind of time that that'd be a serious conversation and we try to make something happen. Anyway, crowded at the bottom, lonely at the top. How did you feel about being the only one? I know in both of your cases, many times you have been and still are the only one in the room. And how did you get greater representation, greater visibility? Brickson, you want to start?
Yeah. I mean, so I have always been someone who felt like if I walked in the room and it was filled with us, I needed to go to some place where I could be more of a pioneer in terms of bringing us in the room, right? If I look back to Sundance, where I started going in 2005 and said, this is amazing, things are happening for people's careers that I could never dream. Why are there Black people here? How do we get Black people here? And so for me, it has been going to those landscapes where we aren't and getting us there has been my blessing to feel comfortable in those spaces and comfortable raising hell. And not just raising hell, but raising money and getting people there. So quickly, if I look at Sundance, when we started Black House in 2007, there were 7 Black films in the festival. We had a panel with 4 panelists and maybe 9 people in the audience. If you flash forward to 2020, there were 56 films, VR episodic projects that I would count as Black at Sundance, and 5 distinct spaces on the mountain, all packed to the gills at every single moment of the weekend. So I go to those places and I bring Black.
Good. Fred?
Well, I can say that when I was at Yale a few years ago, there were about 13 Black professors who were tenured, full professors, out of about close to 500 in arts and sciences who were tenured. And so it was hard not to go into a space and not be the only one. And it was also difficult not to go into a space and not be sort of, once even asked if I was in the right place. Actually more than once, but in different ways. And then the next line was, "Oh, but you look so young," as to be a professor. And I said, "Oh yes, I'm sure it is about the look." And so I think part of what happens is we both have to not get distracted when we're in those spaces, because there are all of these little slights that are meant to sort of distract. And so the energy that I would have spent trying to do those corrections was much better spent pushing through particular kinds of hires and or making sure that our students of color, and we had quite a few Black queer students of color, were taken care of and had their talents appropriately appraised in the back rooms. And so part of, I think, what we do is we learn how not to let those types of attacks be a distraction.
Reggie,
I'm sorry.
can I jump in for a second? I think it's also about choosing the room, right? There are some rooms where you just you don't need to stress yourself that much, right? It's not worth the price. You have to do the calculus to say, is there room to make a difference here? And if there's not, you just take your toys and go home.
Right. Which, I was actually going to make that point that from my perspective, and I have many, many mentees and many people asking me for advice. And my first question is, did you take the time to understand the game that's being played in that environment? What does that room feel like? Who are the winners? You can see in the room who's getting the attention, who's getting the reward. And so the first question is this a game that you can play and win at? And the next question is this a game that you want to play? You want to be in that room. You have a choice to be in the room or not be in the room. And I don't believe in this getting in this room and complaining about leave the room, right? If you're going to be in the room, make it work for you. My other observation is I have learned over time how to celebrate being the different person in the room and how to use that to my advantage. And you don't know how many times I've met people 10 years, 20 years after I first met them, and they remembered having met me because I was distinctive in the room, right? And I would say something to make myself have a voice and be distinct in the room. So my advice always is, one, make sure you understand the room you're in, and it's a room that you want to be in, that you're in it explicitly because you want to be there. And then to really make sure that you are distinguishing yourself and using that to your advantage as much as possible. So that's sort of my answer to the question. We probably have time for just one more question. I think we have 2 or 3 more minutes. I think we touched upon this with the lower life expectancy for Black men. How does that factor into our timing and approach to savings, even retirement and Social Security? How do we think about that? Brickson, you want to start?
Careful, it might surprise you, right? Right? The last thing you want to do is run out of money. I'd rather run out of time than run out of resources. So I would probably push back on the premise. We just don't know, right? And I wouldn't want to see you take the wrong gamble and be, lots of years to go and no resources to keep you safe and loved.
Yes.
I would just add that wealth protects. And so one of the things that some people have done when looking at life expectancy is that they'll say, "Oh, your dad had had a lot of heart problems, and somehow by virtue of you having wealth, you don't have the same types of cardiovascular issues that your father had." Why? Wealth protects. And so there's something about the removal of worry. So I think thinking about how to structure your finances so that you have the removal of worry, that's enough to actually protect you and allow you to sort of have a longer and more abundant lifespan.
So that may have been your final word, but just in case, final word from you, Fred, to the group, to the participants.
Oh, a final word.
Or final words.
The final words are, don't take your talents for granted, and try not to sort of try to make sure that the things that are different about you are lifted up and acknowledged and used as a strength.
Good. Brickson?
Yeah, I have a really great friend that I came to know. I didn't talk about the board service a lot here, but board service and philanthropy has been a really enriching part of my life. And Merle Hilliard, a Jewish guy whose wife I was on the board with, said to me about money: if there were half as much as they think I have twice as much as there is, right? And so this notion of not worrying about what people think about you and about your money, and worrying about how it supports you and how it gives you freedom, love, and passion is my best advice.
Good, good. And my parting words are, to me, and some of you have heard this before, there are 4 C's that I live by and I encourage people to do. The first is courage, because the world will tell you what you cannot do. And sometimes you have to have the courage to go for it yourself. The second is confidence, because there are a lot of haters around there that are trying to pull you down. And you have to build your confidence and try to surround yourself with people to help you build your confidence. Not necessarily people to say yes to you about everything, but people who are considered about you. They're concerned about you. The third is competence. So know what you're doing, know your craft, study, burn the midnight oil, do what you need to do to be competent in what you do. And the last is community, because at the end of the day, we're all a part of the community. And if you lose sight of that, you can have a lot of wealth and have great emptiness in your later years. So with that, I thank you all. This has been instructive for me, and I hope for others as well. And Emil, I'll turn it back to you now.